The most important deal of Alexander Thorne's life wasn't negotiated in a glass-walled skyscraper overlooking the city. It was settled in a sunlit room that smelled of lemongrass and loss, and the person across from him wasn't a rival billionaire. She was a 22-year-old volunteer named Alara, whose only leverage was the unshakable conviction of her own heart. Alexander, at 39, was the architect of his own universe. As the CEO of Ethelgard Industries, his world was one of crisp, calculated risks and cold, hard logic. He'd built an empire on the principle that every problem could be broken down into data and every human variable could be optimized. He'd arrived at the Willowbrook Palliative Care Center for a simple, surgical strike, evaluate the financials, deem the facility a non-performing asset, and execute its closure with the detached efficiency that had made him a legend. It was, his spreadsheet told him, the only logical conclusion. Willowbrook existed in a different dimension. Time moved slower here, measured not in quarterly reports, but in heartbeats and shared memories. It was in this quiet world that Alara Vance was a beacon. A psychology student and part-time, she navigated the hushed halls with a gentle radiance that seemed to soften the edges of the hard, clinical reality. Her world ran on a different economy, one of compassion, presence, and the sacred duty of listening to stories that would soon become legacies. Their first collision was a clash of civilizations. Alexander, encased in a suit that cost more than the center's monthly art supply budget, was in the director's office, his voice a low, relentless hum. The numbers don't lie. The occupancy rate is unsustainable. The overhead is a constant bleed. This isn't a care center. It's a sentimental fantasy propped up by debt. Alara, passing by with a basket of freshly folded linens, heard the cold verdict through the open door. She didn't storm in. She simply stopped, a still point in the hallway, urged, satisfied with his own ruthless logic. He nearly walked right past her, but something in her stillness made him pause. She looked at him not with anger, but with a profound, weary sadness that was far more disarming. "You're right," she said, her voice quiet but clear, like a bell in the still air. "The numbers probably don't lie, but they don't tell the whole truth either." She stepped closer, and he caught a faint scent of lavender. "That unsustainable occupancy rate is Mr. Henderson in room 3B, a master carpenter who is teaching me how to carve a rose from a block of cherrywood. That bleeding overhead pays for the music therapist who helps Mrs. Gable in 2A remember the lyrics to the songs she danced to with her husband. You're not just looking at a column of red numbers, Mr. Thorne. You're looking at the last living room of 27 people. And you've already decided to turn out the lights." Alexander, a man who had stared down hostile takeovers without blinking, found himself utterly disarmed. Her words weren't a business rebuttal. They were a moral one. They bypassed his intellect and struck a chord in a place he'd sealed off years ago. He offered a stiff nod and left, but her words and the image of her steadfast gaze followed him into his sleek, silent car and all the way back to his sterile penthouse. He couldn't explain why he returned the next day. He told his executive assistant he was gathering more nuanced data for a comprehensive review. A lie. He was there to see her. He watched from a distance as she laughed with a woman while carefully painting her fragile nails a bright, cheerful pink. He saw her sit for a half hour, holding the hand who said nothing, her presence a silent vigil of respect. Hesitantly, almost awkwardly, he began to participate. He started with Mr. Henderson, offering to hold the sandpaper as the old man guided his hand, showing him the rhythm of revealing the grain beneath the rough surface. Alexander's mind, which could deconstruct a multi-billion-dollar market, was humbled by the focused patience required to create a single, smooth curve on a piece of wood. He brought in a state-of-the-art, wireless audio system for Mrs. Gable, only to be gently corrected by Alara. "It's not about the quality of the sound," she explained softly, holding up an old, crackling vinyl record. "It's about the sound. This is the exact record she listened to the night she met her husband. The pops and hisses are part of the memory. He was being rebuilt, piece by piece. The armor of his certitude was being patiently disassembled not by argument, but by experience. He began to have real conversations with Alara in the center's small garden, surrounded by late-blooming flowers. He found himself telling her things he'd never told anyone, about his own father's lonely death in a similar facility, an event he'd buried under a mountain of work and wealth, treating the grief as just another problem to be outsourced and ignored. "I thought I was being strong," he confessed one afternoon, his voice rough. "I thought feeling it would be a weakness." Alara placed her hand over his. Her touch was warm and sure. "Not feeling it is what made you weak," she said gently. "It cut you off from yourself. Strength isn't a wall, Alexander. It's the bridge you build to cross the pain." The emotional climax of his transformation came on a Tuesday. Mr. Henderson had taken a sudden turn for the worse. Alexander, who had a merger closing that morning, found himself canceling the meeting without a second thought. He arrived at Willowbrook to find the door to 3B partially closed. Alara was inside. He pushed the door open gently. The room was quiet, filled only with the soft rhythm of labored breathing. Alara was sitting by the bed, holding Mr. Henderson's gnarled hand in both of hers. She wasn't crying. She was speaking to him in a low, steady voice, telling him the story of the first wooden bird he had taught her to carve, describing the feel of the wood and the smell of the varnish. Alexander stood frozen in the doorway, a witness to a sacred moment. This was not a failure or a deficit. This was a triumph of humanity. When Mr. Henderson's breathing finally quieted, a profound silence settled over the room. Alara carefully placed his hand on his chest and leaned forward, pressing a kiss to his forehead. When she finally looked up and saw Alexander, her eyes held an ocean of sadness, but also a deep, abiding peace. He moved into the room, and without a word, he opened his arms. She walked into them, burying her face in his chest. He held her tightly, his own tears falling silently into her hair. He cried for the kind old carpenter, for the father he'd failed, for all the years he'd spent valuing the wrong things. In that raw, vulnerable space, the last barrier between them dissolved. He was no longer a CEO saving a facility. He was just a man, holding the woman he loved as she navigated the deepest truth of life. He didn't just save Willowbrook. He reinvented it. The following week, at a board meeting he had once dreaded, he presented a new proposal. He didn't ask for approval. He announced a new corporate directive. "We're not just investing in Willowbrook," he stated, his voice carrying a new, quiet authority that had nothing to do with stock options. "We are launching the Willowbrook Initiative. Our new corporate KPI will not just be shareholder return, but human return. We will fund this not as charity, but as R&D for the soul of this company. This is non-negotiable." The clause was passed. It became his legacy. The romance that blossomed was quiet and deep, built on a foundation of shared purpose and healed wounds. He learned to leave his suits at the office, spending evenings with Alara in his penthouse, not at fancy restaurants, but cooking together, talking for hours, her well-worn copy of poetry collections finding a home on his previously barren shelves. She teased him about his hopelessness at whittling, and he helped her structure her thesis, his analytical mind now in service of her compassion. The story's moral was woven into the very fabric of his being. True success isn't about scaling heights alone. It's about how many people you bring with you and how much humanity you allow yourself to feel on the journey. The story ends 1 year later. Alexander is in the Willowbrook garden, but he's not in a suit. He's wearing a simple sweater, sitting on a bench next to Mrs. Gable. He's reading a letter from her granddaughter, who is studying abroad. His voice is soft, his expression one of easy contentment. On his desk at Ethelgard, next to the quarterly reports, sits the small, perfectly carved cherrywood rose Mr. Henderson helped him finish. Alara watches them from the doorway, her heart full. She sees not a billionaire CEO, but a good man. He had mastered the world of finance and power, but his greatest victory was in learning the delicate, invaluable craft of the heart. And that, they both knew, was a success no algorithm could ever calculate.